Help us, Intel. You're our only hope.
Thanks, Steve.
We've been doing a lot of digging the last couple months, and it's because of the title of this video. One of Intel's ARC GPU partners we spoke with for this piece said that they're selling through of every order of B580s that they make. They also said that they have lead times now of 8 months from placing the order to actually getting the products on the store shelves. They told us that Intel is struggling to supply enough GPU silicon to partners for making the actual video cards in the ARC series. Another GPU partner for Intel ARC told us that their primary concern is whether Intel will commit enough resources to its Intel ARC GPUs to establish a foothold in the consumer GPU market, informing us that they want to buy more GPUs, but that Intel's speed for its supply chain just isn't as established yet and as mature as NVIDIA and AMD's. And one of our last unpublished stories that we started on in Computex of this year, May, is about Intel ARC. And what we did was we went and gathered as much information as we could from as many of Intel's ARC GPU partners as we could and put together this piece. Also, as part of this special report, I spent some time finding some of the factories that make products that Intel ARC GPUs go into and talking to some of the factory workers and representatives about their experiences on the business side. So this report goes into some of the information we've been able to unearth. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Antec Flux series of cases. We previously benchmarked and independently reviewed the Flux Pro case and found it to be one of the best cases we tested last year. The Flux Pro features the modern trend of wood accents while also focusing on a high airflow design. We found its performance to be among the best in our thermal testing. The case also has a number of ease of installation features to make assembly and cable management easier. Learn more at the link in the description below. The GPU market has been a mess between NVIDIA, which is behaving like a monopoly, and AMD, which is behaving like a token intended to show that it's not a monopoly. Or at least AMD seems to have a limit to how competitive it's willing to be with NVIDIA. Despite a rough start, Intel ARC has made a lot of ground. For example, this data from our RTX 50 series and RX 90 series reviews shows that the B580 GPUs are already competitive with some of the newest GPUs from NVIDIA and AMD, especially when looking at the RTX 5060 and sometimes even the 5060 Ti. Considering the B580 is already at these levels, the RTX 5050 has no shot at competing with it in these games where it's already ahead and likely will cost around the same, with the exception of possibly one problem that we're going to talk about today, which is that Intel, like AMD and NVIDIA, has struggled to maintain its actual MSRP, and we've actually got a full separate deep dive on that coming up, talking about all of the GPU prices. But the reasons not to buy Intel ARC have been pretty obvious since Alchemist, which was its first generation, and they were primarily drivers, game compatibility, and just the general aura of clusterfuck that the original round of Intel software for ARC was. But it's gotten a lot better. The first generation was a disaster. Alchemist was absolutely plagued with driver problems, including dozens of bugs that we found in initial testing, which triggered an Intel round of bug fixes, actually crediting us for the discovery of some of them, which is not something we've really experienced before. Even when we liked the Alchemist hardware at the price, the driver compatibility issues early on and the bugs throughout its life made it impossible to recommend to anyone but an enthusiast who was looking for a toy to tinker with. And even then, we recommended that those buyers have backup GPUs available in case it just simply doesn't work with your game you want to play. And one of the things we learned in this report collecting information was that its #1 reason for delay in launches has been the software, not the hardware. So the drivers are far better now. We've talked about that. The games are more broadly stable rather than broadly unstable. And performance is competitive in several games we've tested, but definitely not all of them. It still sometimes has, for example, frame time consistency problems or DX11 problems. A B580 is something we can actually suggest sometimes, considering it's in a market filled with underperformers in its price category. It's still not as clean of a recommendation, though, as AMD. Intel is at a point where it needs every partner it can get to make its GPU successful. As a contrast, NVIDIA is big enough that everyone wants the GPU allocation so they can sell more products, and so they're willing to bend over backwards for NVIDIA or be bent over backwards by NVIDIA. And then on the AMD side, they're just kind of established at this point. So this will focus on the Intel side. The most interesting information we got was related to sales volume and production times. We have some of that. We'll expand on the topics, but here's a top-level recap of what we're talking about today, so you get the Important stuff up front. One partner's sales volume is up 5x versus Alchemist at 2,000 B580 units per month, up from about 250 to 400 units per month of A770. Partners tell GN that Intel gives them the most freedom in board design out of all three GPU makers. Intel's only requirement for, we'll call them weird video card designs, is that the partners support RMAs and customers. Intel's primary pressure applied to partners, we're told by the partners, is customer-facing, with Intel seeking to build a positive reputation for end users by enabling its partners to be more, the quote we got was, aggressively helpful, end quote, in RMA situations. GN has not tested these RMAs yet. We can't validate that statement at this time, but that is what we were told. More dual GPU cards are being designed by partners, don't know if they'll launch yet, following the popularity, at least in coverage, around Maxon's B60 Pro, whether or not it actually sells. Lead time is up to 6 months from order to factory for GPUs. In some cases, lead time total is 8 months from order to shelf for consumers for ARC GPUs for gaming. Partners also therefore have higher volume orders completing now that were placed earlier this year. The partners maintaining lower prices can't keep the stock, and those who refuse to drop have more inventory as it should be. Intel's top concern is a repeat of Alchemist's driver and software situation, and all this is based on what we've been told by Intel's partners. Here's some more of the basics. Intel Arc video cards are currently made by a limited set of companies. These include 5 main partners and Intel first-party cards. This isn't news, but it's helpful history for those of you watching. Onyx, which is one of Intel's new partners. Gunner, which shipped the A series as well. Sparkle, which seems to us like Intel's premier partner and holds a similar status to EVGA from what we can see, but is still small. Actually, some of Sparkle's team came from EVGA. There's also ASRock, which is another of the larger partners. Acer, which is the biggest of all these and makes separately sold add-in boards for ARC, but it's also best known for laptops, pre-built monitors, and is publicly traded with a market cap of over 90 billion Taiwan dollars, or over 3 billion US dollars. And Intel itself, of course, designs the GPU, TSMC makes it, and Intel ships its own self-branded limited edition GPUs at MSRP for some of its models. For perspective, NVIDIA has multiples of this list of partners, and they cover specialized regions and things like that. So very big difference in where the leverage is. Now, one thing that's interesting is as you look into the history of all these companies, you start to realize that even the exclusive brands for a given GPU vendor, when you look at the parent company and the structure, it might not be as exclusive as it seems. It's not a secret, but it's something that a lot of just sort of casual PC building enjoyers might not know about. It's kind of interesting context. Sparkle Computer's been around since 1982 and actually used to sell GeForce 8000 series cards like the 8800. Sparkle and NVIDIA parted ways sometime after the GTX 600 or 700 series, and the company left GPUs nearly altogether after that, other than media accelerator type products. When EVGA disbanded, some of its staff went to Sparkle actually, just as the company began its partnership with Intel Arc, and Sparkle is now owned by TUL, or TUL, which also happens to own AMD exclusive partner Power Color, and in fact they even share a factory. These two vendor exclusive companies have the same parent. Onyx, meanwhile, has been widely reported as being owned by the same company that owns Sapphire, AMD's other exclusive partner. ASRock currently makes AMD and Intel GPUs and is part of the Pegatron group, which was initially part of the Asus group and was split off from Asus in 2010. Gunner was Intel's first board partner in China when it went into the UNO and later into the Unconwa. We don't know anything about this company at this point. Acer doesn't need an introduction and is gigantic. They also made the Bifrost that tested well for Intel Arc previously, and the company has been trying to become an NVIDIA partner for years for AIB sales, but NVIDIA has blocked it. Now Acer makes AMD and Intel GPUs. We spoke with one of Intel's partners and learned that the company is selling every Arc GPU that it's able to stock in the new Battlemage series, and this company in particular is doing the following for numbers. They say 2,000 units of B580 per month, 1,000 to 2,000 units of low-profile A310 per month, so that's still selling as display out basically. And at its peak, the same company was selling 100 units of A770 per week at around 400 per month. And that was the peak for this particular partner. So they're already something like 5x what they were for Alchemist. These numbers, though, they don't really mean anything without some context. So we spoke to some former EVGA employees to ask them about the sales volume from back in the day. And then I went and dug through my records, speaking with the EVGA CEO in the past, and he had given us some numbers that we've shared at various points over the last decade or so that I can also include here. So for manufacturing volume of the RTX 3060, which varied in its life from about $300 at the low end, I think it was $330 MSRP, up to about $400 commonly. EVGA was selling around 30 to 40,000 of these RTX 3060s per month at one point in its history according to a former EVGA employee we spoke with and another source that we worked with. And when a partner sells these cards, they sell them typically to a distributor, sometimes straight to a large retailer. They sell them to SIs, OEMs. There's a lot of places they go. And on a separate note, that is one hell of a fuck you to NVIDIA from EVGA to cut off that amount of money to make the statement they did. And as we look more and more to the future, EVGA was right in a lot of what it was saying. So that helps set sort of the ceiling and some of the scale. That was 2021 or thereabouts with the 3060s. Intel's partners, one of them is at 1/15 of that volume. Intel has a long way to go here. Custom cards are important for partners because it's one of the few ways they can really differentiate themselves not only from each other, but from their actual GPU supplier, so that they're not just competing with their own supplier, which gets the GPUs obviously for a lower cost. And so another big aspect of Intel's partnership expressed to us by its board partners consistently across all the ones we spoke with has been the freedom of design. One of the things we've consistently heard about NVIDIA, as an example, from its partners is that it is a, quote, control freak about how the video cards are made by the partners and what designs the partners ship out to the market. So one time in NVIDIA PM, like someone actually at NVIDIA told us in a meeting with PR in the room, which is insane for different reasons, we're going back to a long time ago now, but told us that they would, quote, tighten the screws, end quote, on partners with relation to laptop designs that used NVIDIA GPUs, which is like the most distant possible thing you can make with an NVIDIA product, where the vast majority of everything else in there is not NVIDIA. For AMD, partners have told us that the company isn't particularly controlling, but is not particularly directly supportive either, meaning that they have more limited engineering and design resources available, mostly employees and staff, to help with custom designs and for innovation. Intel is different though, which is probably for good reason, because nobody wanted Intel for Alchemist, and for Battlemage, it's still fighting with its own reputation. So it makes sense that Intel's more open with its partners. Maxon went on record with us previously when we tore down its dual GPU PCB for the new B60 Pro cards. They said that Intel was very supportive of this, and the dual B60 wasn't even an official Intel SKU. As I use EVGA as an example again, there was a time where EVGA made its own custom dual GPU board, even though it wasn't an official NVIDIA SKU. And the end result of that, as we were told by former EVGA staff, was NVIDIA clamping down on such things in the future and preventing them. Dual GPU cards are uncommon today for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of good reasons that they're not common, and that's not what we want more of. But the point is that a dual GPU board is probably the maximum amount of freedom you can give to a partner if it's not an official SKU from the GPU maker itself. And that's because it's, first of all, it's like the number one thing that could just really perform awfully and get super screwed up in design. So they allow that, they allow a lot of things. The reasons there haven't been more of them over the years, for example, like the GTX 690s and AMD's 295X2 and stuff like that, is driver problems for gaming use cases, frame time issues. The memory isn't even accessible by a single GPU. It's split into two discrete banks of memory for those two GPUs in the older designs we had, and splitting PCIe bandwidth. But when we spoke to Maxon, it was at an Intel event, and Maxon just happened to be there representing their own product. So both companies were in the room. We asked Maxon if Intel would let them make a dual GPU gaming card if they wanted to, and the company told us in Intel's presence that it could if it wanted to. We asked Sparkle on record what kinds of controls Intel exerts over the custom PCB and cooler process. A former EVGA employee at Sparkle told us, quote, Intel says we can do whatever we want. They say if you can cover the RMA, no problem. Make any card you want, just cover the RMAs and take care of the customers, end quote. And this is in stark contrast to what EVGA's famed overclocker Kingpin told us previously on camera about EVGA custom designs and NVIDIA controlling them.
Interestingly enough, when we originally did the 3090 Ti, they told me I couldn't put two power connectors on the card.
Who's they? EVGA or?
They.
They,
Yeah.
Got it. And there's a lot of record of that over the years. Previously, we spoke to former EVGA mad scientist Tin, who once joined us to do this.
Oh yeah.
There it is.
A very important tool.
Oh, cool. which was for educational purposes, to be clear. One of the things that Tin specialized in was firmware and BIOS tuning for the cards that they shipped for overclocking. We learned that EVGA suspected NVIDIA of reverse engineering their hardware and firmware solutions to then later intentionally block certain avenues to making the cards better, for overclocking especially. In some cases, these could be used to make lower down cards outperform higher cost GPUs by overclocking, which obviously would mean fewer sales of the higher end ones. And so back to the power connector situation from Kingpin as an example, we asked Maxsun, what about power connectors? And they said, Intel doesn't care. We can use whatever type we want and however many of them we want, as long as we have enough to supply the base power. And likewise, when we asked Maxsun and Sparkle about, well, what about the power budget? Are you allowed to offer however much percent overhead you want for overclocking? And we were told back at Computex, yes, as long as the card is safe and as long as it's covered by the support team and as long as it gets the power delivery it needs and has a good VRM, then they can tune it. Now, all of this sounds great from the partners. There's a couple things to remember here. One of them is that the partners are invested in their own success. But some of these same people I've spoken to, not necessarily companies, but the people working at them who've moved from companies, are the same people who have complained and thrown AMD and NVIDIA under the bus in the past when we've talked about whatever the latest problem is from those companies over the past now, in the case of a couple of people we spoke to, about 12 years. And so it's interesting the differences we're hearing from people who at an individual level, you have to kind of think down to the, who are we talking to and where have they worked, where they've worked with all three of these GPU makers now, kind of spanning our list of sources. And Intel's the one getting a different story. But it also makes sense because Intel needs to be different. And it doesn't have a lot it can offer, it sounds like, in terms of hitting the supply that the companies want, and obviously generating its own momentum with marketing, where NVIDIA can basically put out a picture of its logo and instantly generate shareholder value. Intel needs to work a lot harder for that, and it has a product that's much harder to sell. So it makes sense that they allow more freedom. One of the things that's come up a lot in our discussions has been that Intel was famously delayed in so far both of its architecture launches and even in some of its sort of sub-product launches within those architectures. So when we spoke to Sparkle, the company told us that Intel is worried about a repeat of the Alchemist situation. Specifically, Intel doesn't want another mess of drivers and software. At Computex, 3 different partners we spoke with confirmed that Intel has had hardware ready in a timely fashion in many instances, but it has chosen to delay to unfuck the drivers, which is also something that we reported on in the past, and in fact is something that Tom Peterson told us in a video about Intel's drivers not too long ago. So that's confirmed from every party involved. One thing Sparkle said to us that we wrote down back at Computex was, quote, Intel doesn't want Alchemist again, where it's all our drivers are bad, our software is bad, end quote. Now, on one hand, delaying something to make it good is the right move. Gabe Newell said it pretty well.
Late is just for a little while, suck is forever.
On the other hand, of course, if you delay to a point where you've missed the window or where it's not competitive anymore and doesn't make sense, that's a different problem. But it's probably easier to recover from, at least for a company that needs to build a reputation before it can really become an incumbent anyway. It's probably more important to do those delays. So now we get into pricing, where if you look at Newegg, for example, a lot of the Intel B580 cards are $300 at the cheapest, $310. There's plenty that are $380. There's some that are $400 on Amazon, for example, even from Wheelie Out, which is working with, I think it was Gunner, to sell their cards. And the MSRP is supposed to be $250. There have been cards at that price, but like most of the others at MSRP, they don't last. And so it sees a faster sell-through rate of its $250 models. And so talking with a partner, we learned that Intel is sensitive to this, and it is apparently trying to maintain models closer to $250 by incentivizing partners to do so. We don't know exactly what that means. Common incentives for board partners can be things like rebates, for example, where they buy however many units, they get a rebate per unit to help suppress the price. It can also be partnerships of things like free game keys, free whatever physical item they're going to include. It could also be promotional activity. It could be marketing development fund, which is just money to spend on stuff like ads, for example. So a lot of levers that they could pull to try and maintain that price. But that's not really unique to Intel. They're kind of all doing that. Well, AMD definitely has been doing that from what we've seen and what we've heard in credible reports for its 90 series launch. NVIDIA has absolutely done that in the past. We're not sure how much they're doing that kind of level of support to suppress prices right now because they probably don't need to care. But the point is, you look at Newegg or Amazon or wherever else, and there's really not many $250 cards, and when they do pop up, they're gone. So in this pricing aspect, Intel is not particularly unique. It has the same problems as everyone else, except they're a little exaggerated because Intel's a harder sell, and because an increase in price of, let's say, $60 to $100 versus an MSRP of $250, that is a massive percentage. What we have noticed, though, at least, is that inventory seems to stick around a little bit when the prices are over $300, and the ones that are $250 sell through immediately. So competition is working as it should. We're going to show some footage of MSI and Gigabyte factories here, but one of the Intel partners told us that the lead time for an order of GPUs is around half a year, citing 6 months to get the actual GPUs themselves for Intel and its foundry partner. And after this, the partner noted that its own lead time with its contract factories is an additional 2 months to get the GPUs onto boards and into the retail marketplace for consumers, which is relatively quick when you factor in shipping as well. The way this works, just to take the opportunity for some educational content for those of you who don't know, is once a partner receives a GPU, it finds its way into an SMT line, or a surface mount technology line, along with PCBs that are loaded in, templates, masks, and screens for soldering, and reels of components that are used for pick-and-place machines. Most video card production is completed within 2 days, sometimes 1 day, like the MSI factory line we've been to, and that includes SMT, test functions, and physical packaging. So the production time itself doesn't take an additional 2 months, but the lead time also involves the queuing of video cards, and this is where we get back into some of the business for Intel Arc. Most of Intel Arc partners don't have their own factories, and several of them even share factories with competing board partners, sometimes from the same parent, meaning that they have to wait in line for manufacturing. We're going to show some of AMD's 90 series footage. The brands we're showing have nothing to do necessarily with the information we're presenting here. So this was something interesting we learned. One of Intel's partners uses a contract factory that also manufactures AMD partner model GPUs. Actually, a couple of them do. And we were able to track down a factory representative in China and speak off record about this. We learned that whenever a new AMD GPU model launches, partners who make video cards from multiple GPU suppliers, so those who are not exclusive, will often prioritize the non-ARC manufacturing. We learned that this is for a few reasons. One is for relationship maintenance, where AMD and NVIDIA especially can be picky about exactly what they want to see from partners for a launch and what the timing and quantities are. Whereas Intel is still more relaxed with its GPU partners, at least for now. Likewise, we learned that those making AMD GPUs are willing to pay higher rates to jump a line and prioritize orders, whereas there might not be enough profit in that for Intel partners. Speaking with our factory sources, we learned that this also happens with NVIDIA GPUs at contract factories. We're not going to get too deep into the media side strategy today because frankly, it's a little more of a boring topic. It's very businessy, but this also comes into play with Intel's launch planning, and Intel has to navigate AMD and NVIDIA launch cycles where NVIDIA really gets default say. It generates so much of its own momentum and marketing that NVIDIA could ship a literal piece of shit. They've done it. It's called the RTX 5050. It's on its way. And it will still generate discussion and momentum of some kind. And so everyone has to work around that. AMD a lot less so, though. AMD is always in the discussion. They've been there so long with GPUs, and they're there. Intel, though, it needs to wait for a clearing for both AMD and NVIDIA to try and get out there and capture as much of that month as it can for the media cycle before it gets buried by whatever announcements come from its competitors. Whereas AMD and NVIDIA, you'll see them immediately respond to each other. One of them says something, the next day the other one has an announcement. Intel can't play those games. It's not going to win in a battle of just sort of public awareness of whatever it is it's doing. So they have to be careful. And launching the B580 in December certainly helped in a way. It allowed them to get out in front of AMD and NVIDIA's incoming products, which meant they didn't have to compete with them on charts. It also allowed them to put stuff into the market at a time when NVIDIA and AMD supply was running lower because they're both prepping for new products. And then finally, it allowed them to capture about a month or so of full coverage before the 50 series came in and buried it. And then the 90 series hit, and then it was more 50, and then more 90, and so forth, where if you look at the last 6 months, Intel would not have been even detectable in there if it tried to do something meaningful. So they're fighting from the, I guess if we take it back to the Star Wars reference in the title of this video, Intel does not have the high ground. It is definitely on the low ground. It might be, it's like Anakin, except all of the evil powers that happen later, spoiler alert, those are all on the CPU side. The GPU side doesn't get those. I mean, it was probably like a good thing for consumers, but it could use, I'm just saying Intel. You could probably use some of the force right now for some help. And what's interesting about all this is speaking with someone at Intel off record previously, we learned that their #1 goal right now is price. An Intel employee previously told us that, quote, we should be wrapping our GPUs in money when we ship them out the door, end quote, referring to how relatively large the silicon is in comparison to the price. And they're right. By die area, Intel's costs are almost certainly higher per unit than the relatively small dies found on NVIDIA's low end and AMD's low end. AMD has gotten really efficient with the stuff they're making in the 90 series. Lastly, the rumor mill has been spinning up and down again about a potential B770 GPU. There is no substantive news at this time, the time we're filming it anyway, and thus far that rumor has been canceled and uncanceled a couple times, so we're uncertain if such a card is actually in the works or not. Most recently, Intel launched its Pro class cards in the B50 and B60 lines, so it's still doing some stuff. It's just gonna be a while for more consumer. And so we come back to the beginning of this video, which is that the market's been a duopoly for a long time, except AMD's kind of just like a token piece to show that it's technically more than one company. They are there. They have valid products. We talk about them. We just don't think they're fighting, or they have been fighting aggressively enough with NVIDIA to really punch in and carve out a foothold in its biggest openings. It has had the largest opening in years, and AMD was just kind of like, what if we do the absolute minimum to just make people not hate us when we launch the product? And that's just not enough. And that's probably because AMD is so well supported by the success of its CPU division. The challenge for Intel is that it is still fighting itself first. Before it can even begin to succeed against NVIDIA or AMD, it has to win its own battles with its internal issues. Driver development's been steady and it's had significant improvements. At the same time, it's shedding talent rapidly and tightening the grip on funds to target higher margin products, both of which are greatly concerning for Intel Arc. So as long as the holy shareholders and the glorious executives don't see Arc as more of a cost than an investment, it seems okay. That's always been the background concern, though, is at what point does someone go, hey, that's not making money yet. Why don't we stop spending on it? Now, speaking with David Cantor once, a highly technical analyst whom we respect and who joined us to explain how fabrication processes work previously, he once told us that Intel's competition is not NVIDIA, it's AMD. And he expressed, paraphrased, that it was a fight for second place, not for first place. And this conversation was years ago, and he was absolutely right and continues to be right on that. Because right now, if Intel Arc is able to shake up anything in the market at all, we think it's most likely going to be, obviously at the lower end where it's selling, but specifically against AMD, where NVIDIA is always going to have that base that buys NVIDIA no matter what. So we think between the two competitors, AMD would be the one that adjusts itself first, and it would be against Intel. NVIDIA's market share has increased in the time since we had that conversation with David, showing how right he was. But if Intel and AMD start fighting each other for the mid-range and the low end, it might eventually drag NVIDIA down in price with them once there's 2 of 3 there. That's our hope anyway, and we do think the industry needs it, since our firm belief remains that NVIDIA is actively damaging the PC building industry with its monopolistic and anti-consumer behaviors. But it is also not your job as a consumer to kickstart a multi-billion-dollar company like Intel with its endeavors. Intel has to earn that support. The B580 we've talked about in our reviews, if you're curious what we thought about it, and it's making ground absolutely against Alchemist. The problem was that Alchemist set the bar so low that anything other than making ground should have been the instant cancellation of the project. But they did improve at least. So that's it. That's kind of our information we dug up about Intel, what the current situation is. Kind of mix of talking head plus some reporting on the ground, reporting, stuff like that, information gathering. Let us know what you think. A lot of it's just me kind of talking about what it looks like right now, except from more of the what's going on with Intel perspective. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more to support us directly, like our ability to fly out to things like Computex, or to invest the time to find factories and people who work at them and talk to them. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net and buy one of our mod mats, our project and soldering mats, which are highly heat resistant, our copper-plated stainless steel mule mugs, which have an incredibly nerdy thermal conductivity on them, and then you can also grab our dice kits. Thanks as always for the support. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you prefer that. We'll see you all next time.